Alan, thank you for the songs. Appreciate that. Thanks to the elder where I worship, Lowell, for the prayer he offered. And thank you for being here this morning. I hope that as we consider this series on the call to commitment, that you won't think this is a scolding, although there will be some admonishment. I hope that you'll consider this more of a challenge, encouragement, and motivation to be more deeply devoted to God, because not only do we need it, He deserves it. And we should recognize that as we consider what commitment is, especially in the realm of religion, which of course is what we're concerned with this series, we shouldn't think for a moment that religion costs nothing. There is a price to pay for following the Lord in the right way. So I'm going to ask you to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 24. 2 Samuel chapter 24. And I'll just give you a little quick background about what's going on in 2 Samuel 24. It's also related to us in 1 Chronicles 21. David takes it upon himself to number the people. And it seems that the people that he was most interested in numbering, if you look at verse 9, were the warriors in his kingdom. Now, maybe David did this because he wanted to know how big his fighting force was. Well, of course, that's a concern for any ruler. They want to know how big an army that they have, right? And he does this, and even though his closest advisors say this is not a good idea, he goes along with it anyway. And so he does it. And after some point, he realizes through a fellow named Gad, who is his prophet, that God is displeased with this. And God is going to bring some punishment on David for taking it upon himself to do this thing. And the punishment is outlined for us in verse 13. Gad came to David and told him, "Shall 7 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now consider and see what answer I shall return to him who sent me." So Gad says, these are your choices. 7 years of famine. Obviously, that's not very attractive to David, so he doesn't choose that. The next choice is 3 months of fleeing from his enemies. Well, David had spent already a lifetime doing that, and apparently he's not keen on continuing that, because the implication is that after some time his pursuers will catch up with him and do what most pursuers do after a king thereafter, probably kill him. So David chooses 3 days of pestilence, and he's willing to allow disease and death to come upon those very ones whom he's ruling over. And at some point, David looks out and he sees what's happening, and he knows this is because of him, and he's convicted by his sin. Begin with me in verse 15. It says, "So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 men of the people from Dan to Beersheba died." Think about this for a moment. David is seeing his people drop like flies because of him. It says in verse 16, that when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who destroyed the people, "It is enough. Now relax your hand." And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people, and said, "Behold, it is I who sinned, and it is I who have done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house." So David gets it, right? And to his credit, he realizes only after 70,000 people have died that this is all my fault. I'm the one who deserves to be punished, not your people. And so verse 18 says that Gad, the overseer, or rather the seer, the prophet, comes to David that day and says to him, "Go up, erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." David went up according to the word of Gad, just as the Lord had commanded. Araunah looked down and saw the king and his servants crossing over toward him. And Araunah went out and bowed his face to the ground before the king. Then Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" And David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, so that the plague may be held back from the people." And Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer what is good in his sight. Look, the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood." everything, O king, Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. However, the king said to Araunah, no, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. So David brought the threshing floor, or rather he bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Thus the Lord was moved by prayer for the land, and the plague was held back from Israel. Now I love happy endings, and I like the way that this comes out for the end of the plague that had come upon Israel. But what I love even more is the realization that David felt. He knew this was his fault, and he wanted to do what the prophet said he should do. He needed to find a place, build an altar, and offer burnt offerings to God. And yet this fellow Araunah, who owned the land and the oxen and the wood that David intended to use for the offering, says, look, here, you can have it. Now, I get Araunah. He was doing this in service to his king. And maybe there are some of us who feel respect for someone else enough that we would go to great cost to ourselves to offer whatever that person needed to honor God, right? That's what Araunah was doing. But David says no. He says, I need this to cost me something, so I'll buy it. And I don't know how much 50 shekels of silver was worth in that time, but apparently it's a price that David was willing to pay. And he did it, and then we get that happy ending. He offers the sacrifice, and God turns back the pestilence that were killing people. Let's just consider for a little while what sacrifices are. They've been around for a long time, ever since man began to realize that they needed to offer something to a being who was greater than he is. Those sacrifices mean something. Sacrifices help us to realize the multifaceted nature of the motivation of the giver of those sacrifices. For one thing, sacrifices were gifts, right? They were, whether you were offering something to the God of heaven or some pagan idol, you were doing this in hopes that he would receive them with pleasure. Take, for instance, the mythical gods of the Greeks, right? To the Greeks, they were very real. They were just basically supersized humans who had the same needs that humans did. And so oftentimes those sacrifices would include food. They would come to wherever the shrine of that idol or that pagan god was, and they would leave big gifts of food, thinking that this god would need something in that way to sustain himself. And they would do it hoping that, maybe this God knows that it's me who brought this, and he'll look on me favorably. They were offered, though, not only as gifts, but also in homage. It was from man's desire to express devotion and his dependence on one that was mightier than he. Again, whether it's the God of heaven or some pagan idol, they understood that there's a supreme being out there somewhere that deserves to be worshiped. And so they did this in homage. But they were also offered in hopes of fellowship. They wanted a firmer bond of association with that God, whoever it was. Now, certainly those ancient Israelites who brought offerings to the God of heaven wanted to deepen not only their association, but their relationship with him. And so they did this in hopes of having communion with that God. But really, when you think about it, the nature of a sacrifice is that it's sacrificial. We know what a sacrifice is, right? When we have to maybe make a decision about something that competes for our time and something that we really like has to go in order for us to do something else, we say, well, I'll sacrifice this in order to do this, right? There's a cost for us. There's some kind of inconvenience to it. Now, these sacrifices that were offered to God, they not only implied guilt, but most importantly, they cost the giver something. And David in our text recognizes that. He says, I'm not going to offer something to God that doesn't cost me anything. And that's something important regarding religion in general and sacrifices in particular that I hope will help us. And it strikes me what David says there in verse 24. He says, I will not offer burnt sacrifices to Yahweh my God, which cost me nothing. He gets it. He understands how important this is. Let's just consider some of the sacrifices that were offered to God and some of the requirements of those sacrifices, because I think they will help us understand the sacrifice of the devotion that we want to offer to our God, even though there's so many years removed from what these ancient Israelites offered. First, I want you to consider that sacrifices offered to God meant that he always wanted his first and the best. In Malachi chapter 1, head over to the very last book of the Old Testament, Malachi chapter 1. I want you to consider, as you're turning there, what's going on in Malachi. They had finally come back from decades of being exiled to another country. God had punished them for their apostasy and for their unfaithfulness. And you would have think that they learned their lessons, right? They had been away from the temple. They had been away from really exercising their religion the way that they knew it needed to be done, the way that God had commanded them to be done. And when they finally come back, they get back into that lackadaisical attitude all over again. In Malachi chapter 1, beginning in verse 6, God says, "A son honors his father, and a servant his master. Then if I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is my respect? Says the Lord of hosts to you, O priests who despise my name. But you say, how have we despised your name?" God says, this is how. "You are presenting defiled food upon my altar. But you say, how have we defiled you? In that you say, the table of the Lord is to be despised. When you present the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And when you present the lame and the sick, is it not evil? Why not offer it to your governor? Would he be pleased with you? Or would he receive you kindly, says the Lord of hosts? But now will not entreat God's favor. Or rather, now will you not entreat God's favor, that he may be gracious to us? With such an offering on your part, will he receive any of you kindly? Oh, that there were one among you who would shut the gates, that you might not uselessly kindle fire on my altar. I'm not pleased with you, says the Lord of hosts, nor will I accept an offering from you." God goes on telling them about how little they thought about what it was they were offering. And God finally says, look, if you think this offering is so great, why don't you give it to one of your human overseers? Why don't you give it to one of your politicians or one of your rulers? See how much they like it. You know, through the Old Testament requirements of sacrifices, that the animals they offered had to be without blemish. There were all kinds of stipulations regarding what kind of condition that animal had to be in, but most of all, it had to be good. It had to be the best of what they had. And you think about that. The best of your flock, whatever that was probably some animal that you were grooming, that it would be beneficial to your family, whether you were going to slaughter it eventually or whatever. But it was the best that you had. And so to offer that to God, to be burned up, and you never be able to enjoy the benefits of that roast meat, that cost you something. And God says, you're supposed to give me the best, and yet you're not. Well, the implication, I think, is that God deserves the best. And that determination has to be made by the motivation of every giver. So how is it made? Well, I believe that determination stems from love. In 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 3, Paul the apostle said, "If I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing." And I think that was supposed to be the real motivator behind the requirement that God wanted the best. But not only did God deserve the best, he wanted his first. I want you to go with me for a moment, make a left to Deuteronomy chapter 26. Deuteronomy 26. In that Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, before the Israelites had actually even made it into the promised land, Moses told them, when you get there and you begin to harvest from the land, and you begin to offer thanks to God who gave you the opportunity to have this land of promise, you need to remember that what you offer to him is what he desires, what he deserves. In Deuteronomy 26 and in verse 2, actually let's begin in verse 1. Moses says, "Then it shall be, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, and you possess it, and live in it, that you shall take some of the first of all the produce of the ground, which you bring in from your land, that the Lord your God gives you. And you shall put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. Now, this was supposed to be the best that they had. The first was the best. Usually the first of the produce is always the best. It's the most flavorful. I'm from New Mexico, and you may or may not know it, but there's a crop in New Mexico that they grow called green chili. And I'm a chili head. I love it. And I know that the best of that crop, having lived there for decades, is always the first picking. And whenever I can, I go back to New Mexico, timed just right to get that first picking because it's the best, right? Well, God wanted the best. He wanted the first because it was the best. Make a left with me to Numbers. Numbers chapter 18. Numbers 18. In Numbers 18 and in verse 12, Moses from God says, all the best of the fresh oil and all the best of the fresh wine and of the grain, the first fruits of those which they give to the Lord, I give them to you. It's an indication of what you think of God. If you love him enough, and as they were supposed to, if they revered him and respected him enough, well, they would have given not only the best, but the first that God required. And in all of that is an implication that they recognized that God was the one who was responsible for their bounty anyway. Well, God is the one who makes the crops to grow. God is the one who allows them the nutrients that they need to sustain you. God is the one who blessed them over and over and over and over again. So all these sacrifices, all these offerings to God was a way for them to say, oh, this is from you that you have given to me. And by the way, thank you. It was a way for them to express their love and devotion to him. This first fruits concept, I think, teaches that what we give to God is indicative of how we think about him and how much we're willing to give to him. I want you to make a heart right to 2 Corinthians chapter 8 with me, all the way into the New Testament, to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. In 2 Corinthians 8, Paul is talking about a collection that he's taken up for the needy saints in Jerusalem, and he is commending a certain congregation for going over and above in their benevolence. In 2 Corinthians 8, in verse 1, Paul says, now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in support of the saints. And here's where I want to get to, verse 5. And this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Now, Paul says they gave so much to this cause for the relief of the needy saints in Jerusalem. They gave so much that it hurt them. They couldn't even really afford it, but they went beyond what they were able to afford because he says first they gave themselves to the Lord. They were all in, as we spoke about last night. Over in 2 Corinthians 12, go there with me. 2 Corinthians 12, make a right 1 or 2 pages. In 2 Corinthians 12 and in verse 15, Paul speaks about his own willingness to be all in for the Corinthians. He says, I will most gladly spend and be expended for your souls. And if I love you more, am I to be loved less? I love that line that Paul says, I will gladly spend and be expended for your souls. In other words, Paul says, whatever it takes to build you up, whatever it takes to help you, whatever it takes to get you to recognize your own responsibility to God, I'm all in. No matter what it costs me, I will spend myself up in service to you for God. Over in Philippians, make another right to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians 2. In Philippians chapter 2 and in verse 17, Paul speaks of, again, his own sacrifice. He says, even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. Now let me ask you something. When you know that something is going to cost you, when you know that something is going to cost you big, when you realize that there are sacrifices you have to make in order to get to somewhere better, do you lament those things you have to give up? Do you regret whatever it is that you have to push aside, knowing that that's going to be some pleasure, some enjoyment that you're not going to have because of this greater goal that you have? A lot of people do. They regret having to make sacrifices. Paul says, look, I don't regret this at all. He says, in fact, when I think about whatever it is that I have to give of myself, I think of it with joy. You know, oftentimes the apostles did that. They recognized that they considered with joy, they rejoiced in the fact that they would be worthy to suffer for the Lord, because they knew that as living sacrifices, they understood the cost. In James chapter 1, I want you to head over there with me. James chapter 1. Getting back to this idea of first fruits, James refers to Christians, the Christians of his time, as first fruits. In James 1 and in verse 18, the inspired writer says, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. Now, as I understand it, what James is talking about is this first generation bunch of Christians, right? James was written probably very early in the history of the New Testament church. And he's talking about the fact that God has made us, by the exercise of his will, by the kindness of his intention, we are his people now. But he says, we're a first fruits. We're the first of the batch that's coming after us. And you think about us now, many generations later. We can look back at that early church and the sacrifices they made for the Lord as the first fruits of what we can offer to God. He reminds us of how wonderful it is to be part of a family that throughout each generation recognizes its responsibility to God. And all of this is to indicate that sacrifice, real religion costs you. But God doesn't want you to go into it blind. He wants you to recognize this up front so that you can make informed decisions about how you're going to serve him. I want you to make a left with me to the Gospel of Luke. In Luke chapter 14, head over there. In Luke chapter 14. In Luke 14, we're going to begin in verse 26. Jesus said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. And then Jesus gives a couple more examples of the necessity of going into a project, going into a situation with your eyes open. And that's what I think he's getting at here. He says, you can know for sure that the priority you place with me at the center of it is going to cost you something. It might be in a family way, it might be in some other way. But Jesus says, have your eyes open. Realize the cost, because it will cost you something. And I think that's what he wants us to do, to recognize and to think of our commitment to him first, and to give the best of ourselves to him first, because he deserves it. I want you to think for a moment about some people whose sacrifice, whose religion cost them dearly. Think about those three guys in the fiery furnace, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know about you, but if somebody has given me a way out of being burned alive, I'm taking it, right? Maybe that's cowardly, but I can't imagine the pain of being burned alive. And yet these guys had no idea that God was going to really save them. They said, if he does, then wonderful. But if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down to this idol. And so they go into this pit of fire, not knowing what was going to happen to them. That's the point. They did it because of their commitment to God. They did it because of their devotion to him, and they weren't for 1 minute going to sacrifice those convictions. Think about Daniel in the lion's den. By the time Daniel was thrown into that pit where the lions were kept, lions that were starved so that they would pounce on whatever victim was thrown to them, Daniel was an old man. And I don't know if he would have been able to fight off one lion, much less a whole den of them as a young man, but he wasn't a young man. He was an old man by this time. And yet, Daniel was willing to do whatever it took to show his devotion to God. We're going to return to Daniel's example in a bit. I want you to think for a moment about John the Baptist, who was beheaded because he dared to speak truth to power. He told Herod about the fact that it was unlawful for him to have his wife. Now, Herod wasn't a Christian, and he wasn't really even a follower of God. And yet, John told him, your marriage is wrong. And of course, neither Herod nor his wife liked to hear that. And because John dared to speak truth to power, he forfeited his head. But again, he didn't compromise his sacrificial convictions to God. Think about Stephen in Acts chapter 7, who was stoned to death because he dared to rebuke those Jews who were supposed to be leading others more closely to God, but instead led them further and further away from him. And he was killed in one of the most brutal ways you can imagine, to be stoned to death. And of course, again, there's Paul, who after a lifetime of sacrificial devotion to the Lord's cause was beheaded in Rome. None of these that we spoke of were willing to give up their conviction for God. They weren't willing to compromise one iota on their service to him. There is a book, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Fox's Book of Martyrs. Anybody heard of that book? It's a book that begins from the very earliest days of the church and chronicles those who profess a belief in Jesus and had to pay a big price for it. And in fact, they keep updating that book because decade after decade, there are still people in different places in the world who acknowledge Jesus. Whether or not they're New Testament Christians, I won't guess. That's between them and God. But there are people all over the world who profess to know Jesus. And because of that, they may not only have to forfeit freedom, but sometimes even their own lives. Think Muslim countries, where in many of them it is absolutely illegal to the point of death to confess Christ. And yet there are still people who are willing to be martyred for the sacrifice of the service that they give to God. And we need more people like that. We need men and women who understand what real conviction is all about. Listen to this. Somebody wrote, we need men and women who cannot be bought, whose word is their bond, who put character above wealth, who possess conviction, who are larger than their vocations, who do not hesitate to take risks, who will not lose their individuality in a crowd, who will be as honest in small things as in great things, who will make no compromise with wrong, whose ambitions are not confined to their own selfish desires, who are not afraid to stand for the truth when it is unpopular, can say no with emphasis, while all the rest of the world will say yes. We need men and women who will stand up for what they know is right, even knowing that standing up will cost you something. So here's what we've come to this morning. What does your religion cost you? What sacrifices do you make for your devotion to God? We live in a world of ease and convenience, and we like it that way. I've shared with you last night that I really do. I like opening my fridge and having food immediately available for me. I like getting in my car and going places, knowing that probably I'm going to get from point A to point B and then back again. I like the comfort and the luxury in which God allows me to live. But all over the world, people are watering down true religion in order to make it more palatable in our society of ease and convenience, in order to make it less offensive. I saw a documentary on TV several years ago. It was called In the Name of God. And back then they were highlighting one of the very first mega churches. Now there's a whole bunch of them all over the country, but back then Willow Creek, just outside of Chicago, was one of the first mega churches, and they had tens of thousands in attendance every week. I mean, huge, huge church. And they want to know what was the appeal, what was the attractiveness of this church, that it was growing so crazy. And they interviewed a bunch of people. I remember one guy in particular, he stood there and he said, I like going to Willow Creek, he said, because they make it easy for me to be a Christian. And he did this in the interview with a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other. They make it easy for me to be a Christian. I didn't see a lot of conviction there. I didn't see a lot of sacrifice. Somebody said, if there are no demands, there will be no results. A religion that costs nothing is worth what it costs. A religion that costs nothing accomplishes nothing. So again, what does your religion cost you? What sacrifice are you willing to make, say, in your worship? In Psalm 122, verse 1, the psalmist says simply, I was glad when they said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord, right? Now, this building that you are in is not necessarily the house of the Lord. Now, it's a building that is nothing but drywall and wood and glass and brick, but it itself is just a building. Now, it's set aside for sacred purposes, but it's just a building. You are the house of the Lord. You are the temple of God. So are you glad when Sunday morning rolls around and you've had a hard week and the last thing you feel like doing is rolling out of bed, getting your shower and a quick breakfast and getting to the building so that you can worship? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to do that knowing that the sacrifice means something? Over in Acts chapter 2, I want you to head there. Maybe you're already there. But in Acts chapter 2, at this fledgling church of Christ in Jerusalem, it says they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. They were continually doing it. There was no lackadaisical service in that early church. Now, it's not to say that they were perfect. They had some problems, sure. But they understood the sacrifice of consistency, of perseverance. Let me ask you, what does your religion cost you when you're on vacation? Are you as regular as you should be when you're out of town and the church back in Victoria doesn't know anything about what you're really doing? In Hebrews chapter 10, you know this verse. You could probably quote it to me, but let's head over there. Hebrews chapter 10. In Hebrews 10, the Hebrew writer says that we should not be forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, of course, it's about the importance of regular attendance, and we get that, right? And probably when we're in town, we're as regular as you should be. I mean, you're here on a Saturday morning, which says a lot about you. But what if you were out of town, say, on a Wednesday night? What if you were having to travel for work? As difficult as a day of work out of town might be in the middle of the week, would you seek out a church on Wednesday night or whenever their midweek assembly might happen to be to worship with them, to study the Bible with them? One of the things when my wife and I became Christians that we wanted to do was to be all in. We wanted, because our children were young, we didn't become Christians till we were in our 30s, but we didn't want to be hypocrites. And we wanted to show our kids that whenever God summons his people to worship, because we are his people, we answer. We wanted our children to see the importance of faithfulness. And I'd like to think that now, decades later, that they're raising children of their own, that maybe some of those lessons are still valuable to them. We want our kids to know that we're part of God's family. And to be with others who are of God's family is not a chore. Yes, it's a duty, but it's more than a duty. It's a wonderful privilege that we have. And they needed to see that, not just when we were at home, but when we took our family vacations. That whenever Sunday came around, we were going to find a church. We were going to make sure there was a church before we even got in the car to drive off, that there would be a place that we could worship. Even if we had to drive some distance to get there, we knew where we would be on Sunday. What does your religion cost you in your dress? This is an old cartoon. I love it. I think it's just as applicable now as it ever has been. There's a woman in her slip She says, "Oh, there's the doorbell. I better get it." And the daughter, in much less than a slip, says, "I'm dressed. I'll get it." It's not hard to see the difference in what is covered and what isn't, right? In 1 Peter chapter 3, I want you to head there with me. 1 Peter chapter 3. In 1 Peter 3, in verse 4, Peter says, "Let it be the hidden person of the heart." Or rather, back up to verse 3. He says, "Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God." We could go over to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, which says much the same thing. But the point is that when you're presenting someone or yourself to someone as being a holy and pure person, everything counts. It's not just what's in here, but it's what's out here also. The way that you present yourself says a lot about what's on the inside. Finally, what does your religion cost you in the way of entertainment? I want you to make a hard left to Psalm 101 with me. Psalm 101. I love this passage because even though David or the psalmist didn't know what YouTube or Netflix was, it hits home. In Psalm 101 and in verse 3, the psalmist says, "I will set no worthless thing before my eyes. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not fasten its grip on me." I will set no worthless thing before my eyes. My wife and I have a thing on our, we have a little streaming box at home, and that's where we get all our entertainment. We don't have cable. So all our entertainment is streaming stuff. And it used to be, we didn't have a lot of trouble finding family-oriented stuff to watch. But as the years rolled on, it's getting tougher and tougher. It's getting harder and harder to find non-offensive entertainment, right, to put our eyeballs on. So we got this service called VidAngel. And they don't pay me anything. I'm not getting any commission. But what it does is it allows you to filter your entertainment so that some of those worthless things are filtered out of it. And you don't have to listen or see those things that offend what ought to be moral principles. Now, maybe there are other ways that you can do it. But Jesus told us in Mark 4, verse 24, be careful what you listen to. Heed what you hear. Be careful about that. And we try to do that. We want to make sure that what we do, in everything that we do, even in something as seemingly trivial as our entertainment, shows that we respect God, that we love Him, and that we want to do what's right. God desires real sacrifice in all aspects of our lives. Paul said in Romans 6, verses 5 and 7, if we have become united with Him in the likeness of His death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of His resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with Him, in order that our body of sin might be done away, so that we would no longer be slaves to sin, for He who has died is freed from sin. All Paul is saying is that, look, you're not that way anymore. So live like you know you're not that way. He says over in Romans 13, verse 14, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. In Galatians 5, the same apostle says, now those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passion and desires. A different apostle, Peter, says in 1 Peter 2:11, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. You want more? I've got a ton of them. The Bible has a bunch of them, telling us over and over and over again that as people of God, there are costs to following Him. And we've got to be prepared to make those costs. And if Christians everywhere had this attitude and exercised it, I'm telling you, this building would be full. We would be able to, you can look and you can see that this is not the majority of Victoria. And I'm sure that you're busy trying to reach people here. But they need to see first and foremost that you regard your commitment to Jesus Christ as something real, as something tangible, and as something beneficial to you, even if it costs you something. Real sacrifice, right actions, coupled with the right attitudes, will seem like no sacrifice at all. That's real religion. And yes, it costs you something. Well, you've been kind, and I appreciate it. Thanks for listening.